All righty. Thank you, Ellen. And so, she said it perfectly. We have all these invasive insects that we are battling, but there's also all of these invasive plants that, we're at war against. And so it's time to talk about those. And we have two excellent presentations that are going to highlight work dedicated to this task of invasive plant management. And so first off, I'd like to introduce Logan Nutt, and he will be presenting on managing invasive trees. And so Logan graduated with a bachelor's in forestry from UK in 2014 and has been practicing forest management in Kentucky ever since. He started as a forestry technician for the Army at Fort Knox and is now the lead forester for Copperhead Consulting. With Copperhead, Logan manages a team of forestry professionals servicing clients in Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. Invasive species control is one of their most frequent types of projects. So having said that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Logan.
Thank you. I'm having a little bit of video issues, so I'm going to leave my video off, but I'll go ahead and get started and talk about some invasive trees. So we're going to be talking a lot about tree of heaven and polonia specifically today. I'll start with some background information on those two species, kind of move into some commonly recommended treatments when you kind of start talking to other professionals and looking online. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the methods that we've been using for the last several years. We'll talk about some of the specific herbicide mixing recommendations and treatment specifications. And then I'll close the talk by getting into some of the other uses that herbicide mixture can be used for and why I call it almost a silver bullet treatment. So what are Ailanthus and Polonia? They are both highly invasive trees, as a lot of us already know. They come to us from China. Each were introduced in about the 1800s and have become major pests here in the Bluegrass State and the wider region. And they both share several traits that kind of lend to their invasiveness. They have a very high site tolerance. From productive forests to sidewalk cracks, these species can get established just about anywhere. They're both very prolific seed producers, will readily sprout or send up root suckers when their above ground stem is cut or damaged. And they're both extremely fast growing and will begin producing seed at a young age. So getting into a little bit specifics with Ailanthus, it can grow to be a very large tree, reaching heights of 80 feet. The bark is often smooth and brownish gray, but can sometimes have a very rough texture like the one you'll see in the background of the photo on the right. The leaves of Ailanthus are pinnately compound and can range from 1 to 4 feet in length with 10 to 40 leaflets. You can see in the close-up picture that each leaflet has 1 or 2 protruding bumps near the base called glandular teeth. Those are pretty good identifying factors if you're trying to figure out if you're looking at an Ailanthus or something else. And also, if you were to crush the leaves or some of the stems, they give off a very strong odor. A lot of people kind of say that it smells like burnt peanut butter, and I would agree. Some identifying factors with Polonia, slightly smaller in height. They typically reach about 50 to 60 feet in maturity. Can sometimes be mistaken for northern catalpa with the leaf shape. The bark is gray-brown, relatively rough, often developing lighter colored vertical fissures. The leaves are very large, especially on smaller mid-story stems or root sprouts, and they can be 6 to 12 inches long. So just quickly, why do we care about invasive species? Most of you are going to be familiar with that term, but invasive species are those that are not native to our ecosystem and also have negative effects on either the environment or the economy or human health. And through their prolific seeding, root suckering, and some of the other factors I've mentioned, these two species can very quickly begin to dominate some of the forest sites in our area. And are extremely aggressive after any type of disturbance events such as timber sales or some of the storm damage like Alexandra talked about this morning, or in one of the pictures you can see after a fire event, there's just a blanket of polonia in that picture. And we also see these species popping up in mature forests with a lot less disturbance. When you see some of these larger, older stems start to age out and die, you'll see, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, Ailanthus and polonia trying to take their place. Biggest issues with these populations boil down to two things that I've already mentioned, the environment and the economy. By outcompeting native trees and herbaceous plants that should be growing on these sites, the biodiversity and ecosystem function of those sites is severely degraded. One thing I thought was interesting, on the Nature Society website, they said that invasive species have directly attributed to the decline of 42% of the threatened and endangered species in the United States. So that's a pretty big impact from our invasive species. The economic effects are not often seen quite as quickly, but are still just as, or can be just as severe. When these species are present during a timber sale, we often see a tremendous response of new seedlings post-harvest. And in these scenarios, we see the same loss of ecosystem function that I've already mentioned, but we also are going to see a loss of future timber revenues as these sites kind of sit growing essentially worthless trees rather than native trees that we'd like to grow. So what can we do about it? Unfortunately, a lot of mechanical methods aren't going to be very effective. You can't just go cut these trees down. They'll root sprout and you'll end up with more stems than you had to begin with. And so we need to look at herbicide methods in most cases. So if you start trying to look at your options for herbicide methods, there's several options. Foliar treatments being one of them, can be very effective when treating small, newer infestations. It's going to require stems to be about 6 feet in height or lower. You're going to have trouble spraying the canopy of trees any larger than that. Glyphosate and triclopyr can both be effective at a 2% concentration and used with a surfactant. Another downside with foliar treatments is that your overspray or runoff can impact neighboring vegetation. So you're going to end up potentially impacting some non-target vegetation in the process. And foliar treatments are obviously only effective during the growing season, which limits your applications throughout the year. Basal bark treatments are performed by spraying the entire circumference of the base of the stem from the ground to a height of about 12 to 18 inches. And most sources recommend using this treatment on stems with a diameter of 6 inches or less. And so obviously that limits your treatment options when both of these species can very quickly grow to be much larger than that. The solution used for this treatment is typically a 20% concentration of triclopyr 4 mixed with an 80% of an oil-based carrier. And I see this treatment method recommended a lot, but having done it quite a bit, I don't know that it's the most useful. It's in a lot of cases a lot more expensive. You're buying both herbicide and the carrier, and it's a lot more labor intensive than some other options, in my opinion. I'm going to switch gears to 2 more treatment methods real quick: cut, stump, and hack and squirt. And so what we normally look at with cut stump is just removing the stem with a chainsaw and then treating those stumps with herbicide. And when looking online at some sources, a lot of the resources kind of recommended to not use this method with Ailanthus and polonia because they were kind of sticking with glyphosate and triclopyr as the herbicide options. And you see a lot of root sprouting when you treat with those 2 herbicides. And so you still kind of have to come back with a foliar treatment or another option to make sure you clean those up. Hack and squirt treatments are definitely my primary method for treating invasive species. With this method, we're using a hatchet or similar cutting tool to make downward cuts into the stem, cutting through the bark and into the cambium or the living wood tissue. Then an herbicide solution is applied into these cuts. the number of hacks, usually based on the diameter of the target stem, with recommendations changing based on the herbicide you're using and the concentration that you mix it at. Common recommendations include glyphosate and triclopyr 3, ranging from 50 to an undiluted or 100% concentration. Like most things in forestry, there's not a silver bullet for treating invasive species. There's a lot of options. And the variety of treatment methods I've presented so far can be effective in certain situations, but each obviously have their limitations and drawbacks. What we've kind of been using for the last 8-ish years is Imazapyr with a hack and squirt treatment. This herbicide was developed primarily for hardwood control in pine plantations of the Southeast. It's extremely effective at killing a wide range of hardwood trees. And some of the resources online will recommend or mention Imazapyr, but a lot of them don't give you the specifics on how you would use Imazapyr in a treatment, which is why I wanted to focus on it today. But before we get to the actual treatment recommendations, I wanted to take a second and talk about why I think Imazapyr isn't a more commonly recommended solution. And that's the soil activity that we see with Imazapyr. Being a soil active herbicide, if Imazapyr is applied on the ground, it can be absorbed through plant roots and cause injury or mortality. So for that reason, we only use Imazapyr for hack and squirt or cut stump treatments. Other methods that I've mentioned already would have a high likelihood of causing additional non-target effects. And one of the other benefits real quick with Imazapyr is the extended treatment window. So we're able to treat Ailanthus and polonia with Imazapyr from June through February and be very effective. So that gives you a much wider range throughout the year as compared to some of the other treatment methods I mentioned. So the Imazapyr label gives a couple concentration options for the hack and squirt and cut stump treatments. It kind of classifies them as the dilute option and the concentrated option. And we'll kind of focus on the concentrated option today. But even this option in the label is still pretty vague as far as the directions for the user. The label says you can use a solution that ranges from 100% Imazapyr to 25% Imazapyr mixed with 75% water. So that leaves you kind of scratching your head if you're just looking at this label, wondering at what concentration you should mix this herbicide. It's also kind of vague in the number of hacks, and the label says that you should have at least one hack for every 3 inches of diameter on a target stem. And so with both of those ranges, you could kind of go into this and not have a lot of success. And so we've kind of, over the years, had various trials and kind of come to stick with a mixture based with 20% Imazapyr and 80% water. We also use a little bit of dye so you can help to help see the hacks. You can see in the photo some of the blue dye. And we do 1 hack per 2 inches of DBH. A couple important points about hack and squirt methods in general. I mentioned earlier that the hacks have to go all the way through the bark and penetrate the wood. And each hack needs to receive a full milliliter of the herbicide solution. So if you apply less than that into each hack, you're going to see some limited effects and probably wonder why your trees aren't dying. And so just to talk real quick about some of the equipment that we use, we're normally using hatchets, but a machete or other cutting tool would do the trick as well. And most people that are doing hack and squirt treatments are using squirt bottles. And we use squirt bottles for a really long time. But there's a lot of variability in squirt bottles. You can't really be precise in that application into the hack. And so we would have squirt bottles that ranged anywhere from 0.5 milliliter to 2 milliliters every time you pulled the trigger. And actually this past summer, we bought a new batch of squirt bottles and put them into the field without testing them first, and come to realize that those squirt bottles were only applying about 0.5 milliliter and our treatment was not as successful as we wanted it to be. And so we had to go back and kind of clean that up a little bit. But because of that, we started exploring some alternatives to the squirt bottle option and found on the Mississippi Extension website, there was some information about using a bladder bag and a cattle vaccinator to do these treatments. And so we thought, what the heck, give it a shot. And so we ordered a couple, put them together and got into the field. And we've been using them for most of last year and into this year, and it's been great. There's several advantages to the bladder bag cattle vaccinator option over the squirt bottles. You can adjust the application to be very precise and set it at exactly 1 milliliter. The larger capacity of the bladder bags is very helpful. They're about twice as big as the squirt bottle, which allows us to limit the amount of time we have to spend hiking all the way back out of the woods and back to the trucks to refill several times a day. And if you've done this treatment before, you probably know that most of these squirt bottles, no matter how careful you are, you end up with herbicide all over your hands, and you wear gloves, but you end up kind of getting it all over you. This bladder bag and cattle vaccinator setup has been amazingly different and cleaner, and it doesn't leak at all. So I wanted to get just a little bit closer up view of that, just so you guys can see a little more what's going on with our setup here. But we're using just a generic 2-liter bladder bag and a small backpack, and the Prima Tech 2 milliliter cattle vaccinator with a line fill instead of a bottle fill. But you can see that little clear plastic piece. That's where you can adjust your application. And so we can be very precise and know that we're treating each hack with 1 milliliter. We're not going to overtreat. We're not going to undertreat. And I'll wrap up quickly. I just wanted to point out that this Imazapyr solution can be used for a lot more than just Ailanthus and Polonia. It's become our kind of go-to solution for just about everything hack and squirt or cut stump. Having a consistent herbicide solution that cuts down on some of the variety of herbicides that we need to buy and store. And even though other herbicides are often recommended for these treatments, nothing else seems to have the same rate of success that we've seen with Imazapyr. We use it, like I said, for almost all of our cut stump treatments. A lot of invasive shrubs are primarily treated that way: bush honeysuckle, autumn olive. We also do a lot of timber stand improvement, mid-story control, and we use the same method and the same treatment specifications for those treatments. One of the reasons I still kind of call it the almost a silver bullet, Imazapyr can be less effective on a couple groups of plants, legumes in particular. So things like redbud or locusts are not going to be affected as well by Imazapyr. And for some reason, we've also found Imazapyr, at least at the 20% ratio, to be less effective on Bradford pear. And I'm not sure why that is exactly, but I've kind of thought that we need to do some trials at a little higher concentration and see if that helps. But some of our treatments where we've just had a couple random Bradford pears mixed in, we've seen that it hasn't been quite as effective. Some of them were still dying, but they were hanging on a little longer. And so with that, I will wrap up and can take questions or look for them in the chat block, and my email and contact is there if anybody wants to reach out and has further questions after this. So thank you.
All righty. Well, thank you so much for that presentation and all those tips and tricks. I'm sure a lot of us know that, Polonia and Ailanthus are some of our heavy hitters in the invasive insect realm here in Kentucky. Unfortunately, we did have a bit of background noise while you were presenting. So you are, probably going to get some questions in the Q&A there for you. And I think we did have, maybe we could take one aloud, or it looks like we're right at the halfway mark. Maybe we'll wait to do some live questions after we have our second presenter. Is that okay with you, Logan?
That's perfect. Sorry about the background.
Right. No worries.